There is a place in southern Greece where the mountains meet a sea so deep the water looks black. The villages here are not like other villages. Instead of regular houses, the people live in tall stone towers, some 4 or 5 stories high, with tiny windows meant for watching enemies, not for letting in sunlight. For over 1,000 years, the people of this land, a place called the Deep Mani, have been feared by outsiders. They were called pirates. They were called brigands. They were called the fiercest warriors in all of Greece. But there was another story about them, one that never quite went away, whispered by monks and travelers and even the Ottoman officials who ruled Greece for centuries. The story said that the Maniotes were not like other Greeks. It said they had never been conquered, not by anyone, not ever. It said they were the true Greeks, the untouched descendants of the ancient people who built the Parthenon and fought the Persians, hiding all this time at the very edge of the world. For hundreds of years, historians laughed at this idea. They said it was just a legend, the kind of story mountain people everywhere tell about themselves. After all, invaders had swept through Greece again and again. Slavic tribes had come from the north. Frankish crusaders had carved up the land. Venetians had ruled the coasts. The Ottoman Empire had controlled everything for 400 years. Surely no population could survive that many invasions without being mixed and changed beyond recognition. Surely the real ancient Greeks were long gone, their blood scattered and blended into the great mix of the Mediterranean. But in February of 2026, a team of scientists published a study that shocked everyone. They had tested the DNA of men from the Deep Mani, men whose families had lived in those stone towers for as long as anyone could remember. And what they found in the genes of those men should not exist, not according to everything we thought we knew. The DNA showed that these men are the direct descendants of the Bronze Age people who built the palaces of Mycenae, the people who fought in the Trojan War. The rumor was true, the secret was real, and it forces us to ask a question that changes everything. If the ancient Greeks survived here, in this one hidden place, then who were the Greeks really? And where did they actually come from? For most of history, the story of the Greeks has been told as a simple story. We imagine the ancient Greeks as a people who had always lived in their land, like a tree rooted in the same soil since the beginning of time. They simply appeared one day, fully formed, and gave the world democracy and philosophy and epic poetry. This is a story that shaped Western civilization. It tells us that the Greeks are the Greeks, always were, always will be. The Mycenaeans, the heroes of Homer's epics, were just the first Greeks, living on their land, building their golden palaces in peace. The Athenians, the Spartans, all the different Greek tribes were just branches of the same native tree. For centuries, this explanation made perfect sense. It gave the Greeks a claim to their own land stretching back into the time of myths and gods. It gave Europe its origin story, a clean, unbroken line from the ancient world to the modern one. And without any evidence to the contrary, who could doubt it? The ruins of Mycenae still stand. The poems of Homer are still read. The continuity felt obvious. But obvious, as we are learning, is not the same as true. Beneath the surface of this tidy story, buried in the ground beneath the palaces themselves, the earth held secrets that would shatter the simplicity of everything. And those secrets would only be unlocked when science learned to read the language written in our bones. To understand who the Greeks became, we have to understand who was there before them. Long before the word Greek meant anything, before the first words of the Greek language were ever spoken, the Aegean world belonged to a different people. They built their palaces not on the mainland, but on the island of Crete. We call them the Minoans, named for the legendary king Minos and his labyrinth. They were Europe's first great civilization, and for a long time, no one knew where they came from. When the British archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated the Palace of Knossos in the early 1900s, he looked at the beautiful paintings on the walls, showing dark-haired people leaping over bowls and gathering flowers, and he assumed they must have come from somewhere more exotic than Europe. Maybe they were refugees from Libya, he thought, maybe from Egypt. The Minoans seemed too sophisticated to be mere Europeans. But in 2013, scientists finally sequenced the DNA of ancient Minoans from skeletons buried in a cave in Crete. The results were clear and surprising. The Minoans were European, yes, but they were not originally from the Aegean in the way we might imagine. Their DNA showed that they were the direct descendants of the first farmers who had migrated from Anatolia, what is now Turkey, nearly 9,000 years earlier. They were not Greeks. They did not speak Greek. They wrote in a script that remains undeciphered to this day. They were the foundation, the original population upon which everything else will be built. And for thousands of years, they thrived in isolation, their genes distinct, their culture unique. They were the blank canvas, but the painting was yet to come. While the Minoans traded across the Mediterranean, a different world was taking shape on the mainland to the north. This was the world of the Mycenaeans, the people of King Agamemnon, the warriors who sailed for Troy. For decades, the relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans was one of history's great puzzles. The Mycenaeans adopted Minoan art, Minoan writing, Minoan religious symbols. They were clearly influenced by their sophisticated southern neighbors. But were they the same people? Were the Mycenaeans just Minoans who had moved north? Or were they locals who had learned from the masters? In 2017, a major study published in the journal Nature provided the answer, and it was not what anyone expected. An international team of scientists sequenced the DNA of the Mycenaeans from burial sites across mainland Greece and compared it to the DNA of the Minoans. The results showed that the Mycenaeans shared about 3/4 of their ancestry with the Minoans. They were, in a way, cousins, but that missing quarter was the key. The Mycenaeans carried a genetic component that the Minoans completely lacked, ancestry related to the hunter-gatherers of Eastern Europe and Siberia, a lineage that almost certainly arrived through a massive migration of people from the vast Eurasian steppe. These were the people who domesticated the horse, who built no cities but moved with their herds across the grasslands. And somewhere in the centuries before the Mycenaean palaces rose, they came south. They mixed with the local Aegean populations. They brought with them a new language, an early form of Greek. The Mycenaeans were not a pure continuation of the Minoan world. They were something new, a blend, a fusion of the old Aegean people and these newcomers who carried the seeds of a language that would one day shape the Western world. The transformation was complete. The foundations of ancient Greece had been laid by two different peoples meeting in the Bronze Age. And then, around 1200 BCE, the palace civilizations collapsed. The great centers of Mycenaean power were burned and abandoned. Writing disappeared. Trade stopped. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages. For 400 years, the record is almost silent. When the light returns in the 800s BCE, the world has changed again. The city-state has emerged. The alphabet has been adapted from the Phoenicians. Homer has composed his epics. The classical Greek civilization we recognize is born. But the question haunts the historical record. What happened in between? 1,000 years later, when the Roman Empire crumbled, new peoples poured into the Balkans. Historical accounts describe Slavic tribes sweeping into the Peloponnese in the 600s and 700 CE, settling the land, changing the population forever. By the Middle Ages, many historians assumed the genetic link to the ancients must have been broken. The Greeks of the classical era were gone, replaced by a Slavic-influenced population that simply adopted the Greek language and identity. The tension between the story of invasion and the story of continuity became one of the most heated debates in European history. For modern Greeks, building a new nation in the 1800s, the idea of continuity was sacred. For their critics, it was just nationalist fantasy. For decades, there was no way to settle the argument. The bones of the dead kept their silence. But the bones do not keep silence forever. In February 2026, a team of researchers from Greece, Sweden, and the United States published a study that cut through the debate like a blade. They had sequenced the DNA of dozens of men from the deep Mycenae peninsula, the most remote and inaccessible region of southern Greece. The Mycenaeans were famous for their isolation and their fierceness, but were they really the descendants of the ancients, as their own legends claimed? The results were staggering. Unlike almost every other population in the Balkans, the deep Mycenaeans showed virtually no genetic mixing from the Slavic migrations of the early Middle Ages. Their paternal lineages, the DNA passed from father to son, were overwhelmingly of a type that scientists call J2A. Within that type, a specific branch called JL930 accounted for fully half of all the men sampled. By tracing the tiny mutations in this DNA, scientists could build a family tree reaching back into the past. The founding fathers of the modern Deep Maniot population lived approximately 1,500 years ago, right at the transition from the Roman to the medieval world. These men were not Slavs, they were not Albanians, they were not Franks. They were the direct father-to-son descendants of the populations that had lived in southern Greece during the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Classical period, and the Roman era. The genetic continuity was not a myth, it was a fact written in the DNA of men living today. The same DNA that revealed the Deep Maniot's ancient father lines also revealed something unexpected about their mothers. While the father's DNA told the story of isolation and preservation, the mother's DNA, passed from mothers to their children, told the story of connection. The maternal lineages of the Deep Maniots are far more diverse, showing links to populations across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and even North Africa. This pattern is the genetic signature of a warlike society. The men stayed put, generation after generation, defending their territory and passing their names and their DNA to their sons. But they brought women in. Through marriage, through the complex dynamics of family and clan, women from outside communities were brought into the population. The isolation was not absolute. The Maniots were part of a wider world, connected by the sea routes that had linked the Mediterranean for thousands of years. Their genetic story is not one of purity, but of a specific kind of mixture, a mixture shaped by how they lived and how they survived. In the 1300s and 1400s, something else happened. The DNA shows that the clan system the Maniots became famous for, the groups of families claiming descent from a common ancestor, was not a late development as historians had assumed. By analyzing how the Y chromosome family tree branches and splits, scientists could see that the founding fathers of these specific clans lived exactly during those centuries. The social structure that defined Deep Maniot life, with its fortified towers and its fierce family loyalties, was rooted in the medieval period, not invented later. The oral traditions, the stories of descent from heroic ancestors, were not merely legends, they were a cultural memory of real events, the growth and strengthening of family lines that had survived the collapse of empires and the chaos of invasion. For generations, the debate over Greek origins has been framed in the simplest possible terms. Are modern Greeks the pure descendants of the ancients, or are they a mixed population of Slavs and others? This question, loaded with pride and politics, misses the entire point of what the DNA reveals. The Deep Mani study shows that while some populations preserved an incredibly direct link to the Bronze Age, others absorbed different ancestries. The Maniots are the exception, not the rule. Their preservation was made possible by extreme geography, by the barren mountains and the lack of good farmland that made their peninsula unattractive to settlers, and by a culture of violence that made conquest too costly. The rest of Greece was a crossroads, a place where migrations layered upon migrations. The Slavic mixing found in many mainland Greeks is not a mark of being erased, it is a mark of history. It tells the story of people surviving, adapting, blending, and continuing to call themselves Greek. The obsession with purity is a myth that the science itself destroys. There is no single Greek DNA, there never was. The story DNA tells is not that the Greeks weren't Greek, it is that the meaning of Greek has always been one of movement and mixture, of layers built over thousands of years. The 2026 Deep Mani study reveals that the ancient ancestry did not disappear, it went into hiding. It retreated to the mountains and the hard-to-reach peninsulas, waiting for the storms of migration to pass. The people who built the tower houses of the Mani, who fought so fiercely to preserve their independence, were carrying the genetic torch of the Mycenaeans. They proved that the biological link to antiquity was never completely broken, but they also proved that this link was preserved not through isolation alone, but through adaptation, through a way of life that protected the father line while quietly bringing in mothers from across the sea. The story of the Greeks does not become smaller with this knowledge, it becomes larger. It expands to include not only the philosophers of Athens, but also the defiant tower dwellers of the Mycenae, not only the steppe warriors who brought the Greek language, but also the Anatolian farmers who built the first palaces. The identity is not a single note, held across eternity. It is a chord, built from many voices. The secret that was hidden for centuries is finally out. The DNA does not erase the identity of the Greeks, it deepens it and makes it more human. We now know that the story of a people is not written in a single line of descent. It is written in the movements, the meetings, the resistance, and the resilience that leave their trace forever in our genes. In the stone towers of the Mycenae, looking out over that Black Sea, the past is not a memory, it is a living presence, carried in the blood of the men who still bear the names of their ancestors. And what is true for the Greeks is true for all of us. We are not the pure descendants of a single distant past. We are all, in our own way, the living memory of 1,000 hidden histories, written in a code we are only now learning to read. The code was always there, silent in our bones, waiting for the moment when science would finally learn to listen. That moment is now. And the story it tells is more extraordinary than any myth.